Well, the last area I want to focus on in terms of adolescence is social development. And I want to just real quickly review so that you can see it in the context in which a lot of development is talked about, and that's Erik Erikson's Developmental Stages. And he theorized that there were 8 stages of life, and adolescence is one of them. And so he started with, and the other thing that he talks about is stages of life, and then he has critical tasks that are part of each stage of life, and what the resolution of these tasks marks the beginning of the next stage. So the first one, for example, is infancy, and what are the critical issues or critical tasks that are needed during infancy, and that's trust versus mistrust. And he refers to these often in kind of a dichotomous way. So it's trust versus mistrust, and that's infancy. The second one is the idea of toddlerhood, and again, you have a different sorry about that, toddlerhood. And oftentimes the challenge here is autonomy, the ability to operate and manage oneself, autonomy versus shame and doubt. And essentially what he is saying is that when one doesn't resolve the issue of autonomy, oftentimes this is the countervailing force in the person's life itself. Then we go to preschoolers. This is about age 3 to 5. And preschoolers, the way he looks at it is that the critical task issue, if you will, is initiative or guilt. I begin to not only be aware of my ability to manage myself, but taking the initiative over myself is part of that preschooler stage, or guilt. And a lot of times you see people still operating by this, as either they take the initiative because they want to, or they're motivated by the guilt that they experience. And that's 3 to 5 years of age. 4, the next stage beyond that is oftentimes he refers to it as elementary school age children, and we'll just use that for the time being. He uses oftentimes different terms, but elementary age, and what's the tasks, the critical tasks that have to be done during this time is competence versus inferiority. Kids during this time are learning to do things well, develop their own sense of excellence, if you will, versus competence versus inferiority. You see just how, oftentimes you see just how cruel elementary school age kids are with each other, and this is exactly the foundational stages for the development of inferiority. So this is 6 to 12, and then finally adolescence we get to, and the chief task of adolescence in Erikson's mind is all about identity, essentially. And so we've got identity versus role confusion, or confusion itself. And what essentially happens throughout these versus role confusion is that in Erikson's mind, this was a time to solidify who I am. Without that, then the role confusion occurs. And how do I do that? Well, I develop a sense of self by trying on different selves, if you will. Like you see here, some people will take on a social issue, and some of that will help them to, they may feel very passionate about it, but it also becomes part of, woven into their identity itself. And when this identity is tied to a group, we refer to it as a social identity. And this is a key point in time socially for kids to develop their sense of identity. And sometimes it's defined by conformity to a group. Sometimes it's defined by just being independent of a group altogether. And that's part of the key in terms of social development. I think you can't underestimate the impact of two different other groups in this social development, and that's parents/family and peers. And generally speaking, I think most would agree that as a young person grows up, the peers begin to become more and more influential in their lives, and depending on who they hang with will depend in a lot of ways how they develop socially in terms of aligning and connecting with people that are within their peer group itself. Clearly, the graduation from adolescence to adulthood is taking longer, some would say, at least. In the United States, the average age for marriage has increased by more than 4 years. The average age is somewhere in the vicinity of 23 to 25. And this time from 18 to the mid-20s is increasingly not yet settled phase of life in a lot of ways. So you see something that we're now referring to as emerging adulthood, and that during this time young people are attending college like yourselves, but continue to live in their parents' home, which creates a lot of crossover effect between not being able to support themselves and living on their own versus living in their parents. And we see this increasingly with the economy, is that a lot of kids, a lot of young people have gotten a job, done relatively well, living independently, and then get laid off because of the economy and have nowhere to go and end up back in their parents' house, which creates a lot of confusion in terms of roles as to how does a parent behave with an adult child living at home, because the adult child up until that time had been completely independent, running their own lives, making their own decisions, somewhat in a vacuum. And then when they re-enter the family environment, they're impacting other people with the decisions that they make. So those are a few of the top flight aspects of those three areas. We looked at physical, cognitive, and social, and the various stages of life. We got down to stage 5 in Erickson's when adolescence hits. The key tasks is the development of a coherent and integrated identity. Without that, and at least in Erickson's mind, the person suffers from role confusion and then takes that into the next stages of development as an adult.